Hi everyone, welcome to Unit 4. This is our last unit of the semester. It's also our largest unit of the semester. This unit is going to have several chapters, although we're really only looking at the nervous system and the muscular system. We're just looking at different aspects of it in each chapter. So let's go ahead and start with our not really attendance questions before we dive into looking at nervous tissue. First, what are the two tissue classes in the body that are electrically excitable? And next, where are proteins that are destined to leave the cell produced? Now, these will come from very early in the semester, but both of these topics are going to be very important in this chapter. So go ahead and try to answer those before listening to the actual answers. So let's see what the answers are. What are the two tissue classes in the body that are electrically excitable? Well, nervous tissue that we're looking at today and muscle tissue or muscular tissue. Both of those are tissues that respond to electricity and can conduct electricity. Next, where are proteins that are destined to leave the cell produced? They are made on the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Remember, they are made there. They then move to the Golgi, where they are modified, and then they're packaged up in vesicles. Ultimately, they merge with the plasma membrane, and they leave the cell. So let's go ahead and dive into an overview of the nervous tissue. Now, this is going to be a chapter that we look at in 3 separate lectures. Today, we're just doing a very brief introduction, and the next 2 lectures are going to be much more detailed. So before going on to lecture 2 and lecture 3, it's a really good idea if you're not really familiar with, or if you don't remember back in the cell chapter when we talked about the plasma membrane and voltage. It's going to be a good idea to go back and review that because we're really going to dive deep into that topic in our second lecture. But let's begin by talking about body coordination, how different parts of the body are able to coordinate with each other and keep everything working together. And there's really 2 systems that carry out that role. The first is the endocrine system, which is actually covered in Bio 139. And the endocrine system is a system that uses hormones to communicate with different parts of the body. Now, the endocrine system, it's a little slow. It doesn't have a very fast effect, but the effects that it does have are much longer lasting. As opposed to the nervous system, which we're looking at now, the nervous system, instead of hormones, it uses a combination of electricity and neurotransmitters for communication. Now, the nervous system is very, very fast acting. It's almost instantaneous, but the effects are very short-lived. So endocrine uses hormones. It's a little slow, but the effects last a long time. Nervous system uses electricity and neurotransmitters. It's very fast, but the effects don't last very long at all. Now, we briefly touched on something about this back in the very beginning of the semester, but let's really dive into it now and apply it specifically to the nervous system. The nervous system has a lot of different categories, a lot of different organizational regions. So, over the next several chapters, we will start looking at different regions of the nervous system. First and foremost, the nervous system is broken into the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which are all the nerves outside of the brain and spine. Now, I do want to say that central nervous system, it is very common to see it abbreviated CNS. Peripheral nervous system, we see PNS here. I want to caution you that while that is something that you will see from time to time, do not learn PNS as peripheral nervous system. Because PNS, we're going to see in just a moment, is actually more commonly used to mean something very different. And that's how I will use it. That's how other instructors will use it. So please do not learn peripheral nervous system PNS, even though your book does say that. Please don't learn it that way. Now, the peripheral nervous system is further broken down into different regions. There is the sensory half or the motor half. The sensory side of things, this is what's bringing information about your surroundings or about your body towards your central nervous system. So, let's first look at different branches of the sensory division. There are the somatic sensory neurons and the visceral sensory neurons. Somatic, this is your general senses, your special senses. So this is things like when you touch something, or when you feel something is soft, or when you hear something, when you see something, your sense of balance. So general senses and special senses. That is your somatic sensory division. The visceral sensory division, these are things where you are feeling your internal organs. So when you have a stomach ache, when you overstretch a muscle, when your heart is feeling a little quivery, things like that. Those are visceral sensory. Remember, viscera is internal organs. So visceral sensory is the sense of those internal organs. But both somatic sensory and visceral sensory are part of the sensory division. They are sending signals towards your brain and spine. Now over here, the motor division. This is sending information away from your central nervous system, away from your brain and spine. So this is going to cause some sort of response. Your motor division is broken down into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Now your somatic nervous system controls your skeletal muscles, those voluntary muscles. When you're writing your notes, when you're walking down the hallway, when you raise your hand to answer a question in class, when you're chewing your food, all of those are using skeletal muscles. They are voluntary. You are doing that at will. So that is part of your somatic nervous system. Now your autonomic nervous system, the ANS, these are the things that your body is doing in the background involuntarily that keep you alive. So things like your breathing rate, your heart rate, the diameter of your blood vessels, certain glands, things like that, moving food through your digestive tract. That is all stuff that is happening as part of your nervous system, but without you actually thinking about it. That's what the autonomic nervous system does. And the autonomic nervous system is, again, further broken down into two divisions. the sympathetic nervous system, or the SNS, or the parasympathetic nervous system, the PNS. And this is the more common usage for that abbreviation, PNS. Up here, when I said do not learn peripheral nervous system as PNS, that's because PNS more commonly is used to mean the parasympathetic nervous system. So please make sure that you have that filed away in your head. SNS and PNS are used almost every single day when you get to Bio 139, and it means sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. Now, we will come back to these near the end of the semester and look at them in detail. But for right now, what you will need to know is, again, these are divisions of the ANS, the autonomic nervous system. These are going to do things that keep you alive without you thinking about it. The parasympathetic nervous system is summed up as rest and digest, relax and reproduce. Rest and digest, relax and reproduce. So when you're just sitting at home, relaxing on the couch, watching TV, eating a bag of chips, well, while that's happening, the parasympathetic nervous system is what is in control of your body. It's doing things like slowing your breathing rate down. It's helping you to digest those chips. It's keeping your blood pressure low. All of the things that keep you alive when you are relaxed, your parasympathetic nervous system is in control of. Now, let's say suddenly someone kicks in your front door and points a gun at you and starts yelling. Well, your parasympathetic nervous system turns off and your sympathetic nervous system turns on. The sympathetic nervous system, the SNS, is also called your fight or flight response. This is what takes care of stress situations. Now, the situation that I just described is very high stress. It's not always necessarily going to be high stress, just any form of stress. So, what does the SNS do? Exactly the opposite of the PNS. Your fight or flight response says, I'm going to fight for my life or run for my life. It's responsible for things like raising your blood pressure, raising your respiratory rate. It's going to make your heart beat faster. It's going to make your blood vessels constrict. It's going to say, we don't really need to worry so much right now about digesting this food. Let's divert our attention somewhere else to keep you alive right now. So if you've ever heard, about people hulking out when there's something really scary going on, that's the SNS in action. And the thing about the SNS and the PNS is one of them is always turned on and one of them is always turned off. They work against each other and they have opposite effects. But they're doing things to keep your body alive. And we will look at both of these in much more detail later in the semester. But for right now, really what we're going to be looking at are going to be the somatic sensory or the somatic motor neurons. That's really what this chapter is about. All neurons are going to work pretty much the same, but when we're giving examples in this chapter, we're talking about the somatic sensory and the somatic motor neurons. So, what are neurons? Neurons are nerve cells. It's more proper to call them neurons, but they are nerve cells. And that's kind of what we see up here. Now, neurons are the electrically conductive unit of the nervous system. There are actually several different types of nerve cells or of cells in the nervous system. Neurons are what we're going to be lecturing about in this chapter. The other cell types are part of self-study. They do not conduct electricity. They are there to take care of the neurons. So what are some properties of neurons? Well, one, they're highly metabolic. They are very metabolically active. Even when you are at rest, they are still very, very active. But suppose you're just taking a day of study and you're not doing much of anything else. You're just studying hard all day. Well, at the end of the day, you can still be really, really tired. That's because you're using those neurons, and neurons, the more active they are, the more metabolic they are. But even at rest, they are still very metabolically active. They use a lot of ATP. Well, there are also some special characteristics that we say are universal properties of neurons. First is excitability. And this is, they are going to really, really respond to stimuli. They are more responsive to stimuli than any other cells in our body. And how do they respond? Well, that's our next property, conductivity. In response to stimuli, they produce and send electrical signals. Now, I'm going to continue using the words electrical signals today and part of our next lecture. But I'm eventually going to transition and start using words action potential. When you hear the words action potential, that is an electrical signal. It's just a special type of electrical signal. But in general, we're right now talking about conductivity. Neurons can produce and send electrical signals. And finally, secretion. Neurons also have special secretions called neurotransmitters. And these are chemicals that are released by neurons to communicate with other cells. So let's go back to some words that we were using just a little bit earlier and look at the functional classes of neurons. We can kind of classify neurons by where are they and what do they do. So first, sensory input. Now this is also called the afferent side. Afferent means something is going towards the central nervous system. So sensory neurons, they carry signals towards the central nervous system. These are cells that detect some sort of stimulus. They are the detectors of the nervous system. So, for example, if you poke your finger with a needle, then these cells detect that. If you touch something hot, these cells will detect that. Now, they don't know anything. All they do is just send an electrical signal towards the central nervous system. When you poke your finger, when you burn your hand, these neurons do not know that you have poked your finger or burned your hand. All they know is they're going to send an electrical signal to the brain or spine. Now, we have another type of neuron that's going to be integration. Integration or interneurons. Interneurons are found in the central nervous system, either in the brain or in the spine. And interneurons perform this integration process. They are going to receive this sensory input. They are going to make sense of what that electrical signal is conveying, and then they are going to make a decision of what should be done about it. So when I said up here in the sensory input, these neurons didn't know anything. Well, they send the signal to the interneurons, and now meaning is going to be given to that information. What's going to be done about it? Well, if you've touched something hot, we're going to pull your hand away. So that, the actual act of pulling your hand away, is going to be in this last group, motor output. Motor output. This is going to cause the response, and it's going to travel along the efferent pathway. So it's going away from the brain and spine. Afferent goes towards the brain and spine. Interneurons are within either the brain or the spine. And efferent goes away from the brain or spine. So how do you keep afferent and efferent away? I think I may have mentioned this in the very first lecture of the semester, but let's see. A, information is arriving at the central nervous system. E, information is exiting from the central nervous system. Afferent is bringing information to the brain and spine. Efferent is taking information away so that we can respond. Now, most of the time, information is going to go to your brain, where we're going to make sense of it. That sounds like a siren. That looks like an elephant. But sometimes, such as when we touch something hot, information does not take time to go to the brain to be decoded and given meaning, because by that time we may have done really bad damage to our hand. There is an instance where something goes to the spine and immediately we get a response. This is called a reflex arc. If you've ever been in the kitchen and you reach behind you to grab something and you accidentally touch the hot stove, you pull your hand away immediately, even before you realize what you've done. And that's a protective mechanism to make sure you don't do damage. And that's a reflex arc. So let's look at the structure of a neuron. Neurons do not look at all like that generalized cell that we saw back in chapter 3. Neurons are very, very specialized cells. They've got a lot of branches, and that's what we see here in kind of this cartoonized picture and here in an actual photomicrograph. So let's look to see what kind of structures we see on a neuron and how they are very, very specialized for this cell to be able to do what it does. Now, what we're going to see in the next few chapters when we look at both the nervous system and the muscular system, when we're looking at the cells of the nervous system and the muscular system, we still have all of those same structures that we learned about in chapter 3, but a lot of them are going to be given very specialized names. So let's see what some of those names are. First, the cell body, this kind of large swollen area right here, or this very large roundish area right here. This is the cell body, also called the soma, also called the neurosoma. Well, this is just what we have as the actual cell itself. When we were learning about the generalized cell back in chapter 3 and all of the parts that were inside of it, well, those are all found within the soma, within the neurosoma. But we're going to have all these things sticking off of it, and for the most part, those things sticking off of it do not have very many of those organelles that we learned about back in chapter 3. So all of that stuff from chapter 3 is pretty confined in this region right here, the soma, the neurosoma, the cell body. Those all mean the same thing. Soma, neurosoma, cell body. Now, there's a word here called the pericaryon. And the pericaryon, depending on different books, it can be used to mean a couple of different things. Our book uses pericaryon the exact same way it uses neurosoma, soma, or cell body. A lot of other sources use pericaryon to mean the cytoplasm inside the neurosoma. So, perikaryon, just know it could mean the soma itself, it could mean the cytoplasm inside the soma. Next, ganglion and nucleus, or the plurals would be ganglia and nuclei. Here, these words kind of mean the same thing, but they're different based on location. In the body, we typically do not have a single neuron by itself. They like to be clustered together. In the central nervous system, when they are clustered together, we will have a lot of these soma all lumped together in one spot, kind of working together. So a group of soma, or a group of cell bodies in the central nervous system, is called a nucleus. Yes, now I know nucleus we also learned as an organelle, this structure right here. But nucleus has more than one meaning. A nucleus is a cluster of cell bodies of neurons in the central nervous system. Sometimes we'll have the exact same thing, a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, and there we call it a ganglion. So ganglion and nucleus, they're the exact same thing, except ganglion is a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. A nucleus is a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system. Next, neurofibrils. Neurofibrils are a modified version of the cytoskeleton that we find in a neuron. And we see it kind of drawn over here. These are actin fibers, and they're going to kind of form a very specialized web network. And this is actually going to kind of restructure or reshape the rough endoplasmic reticulum. We can see down here these dark areas. These are the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and we can kind of see that they are in the same area that we have pockets up here in these neurofibrils. The neurofibrils form a framework that holds the rough endoplasmic reticulum in place. But the rough endoplasmic reticulum in a neuron is called something else. It's called chromatophilic substance, or sometimes you will see them called missile bodies. Chromatophilic substance, missile bodies, are rough endoplasmic reticulum in a neuron, and they're packed into these clusters and held in place by neurofibrils, a part of the cytoskeleton. Now, since all of these organelles are kind of held in a very small portion of a neuron, up here in the soma, we get a couple of weird features that are pretty unique to neurons. First, neurons are amitotic. That means they do not go through cell division. They do not go through mitosis. That's also why, if you've ever heard someone, if there's nerve damage, if someone breaks their neck, oftentimes that they're paralyzed for life. Well, that's because if you kill a neuron, that neuron will not be replaced because the surviving neurons cannot go through cell division to replace them. But neurons are extremely long-lived. We say they have extreme longevity. That means they live a really long time. How long do they live? Well, in general, they live as long as you do. They can live over 100 years, just like a person can live over 100 years, which is really important if they are amitotic and cannot go through cell division. So back to the cell body. We've got all of these branches coming off of it. These branches are called processes. A process is just a general term for something that sticks off of something else. And there are two different categories of these processes. There are dendrites and axons. Dendrites in drawings tend to be shorter than the axons, although in reality dendrites can be just as long as an axon can. Dendrites, there are more of them, usually. There can be any number of dendrites. Axons, there is only ever one. In some cases that we won't talk about, there might not be any, but there's never more than one axon. There could be 100 dendrites, but one axon. There could be 10 dendrites, one axon. So we will say dendrites, there are lots of them. Axons, there is one of them. Although they do not have to have dendrites, and in special cases, they do not have to have an axon. So what are dendrites and axons? Dendrites are the receiving processes. They are going to receive a signal and send that signal towards the soma, towards the cell body. What kind of signal? Well, electrical signals. So the dendrites receive electrical signals. The axon is going to take the electrical signal away from the cell body. So when we're looking at the flow of electricity, it goes in through the dendrites to the soma and out through the axon, and then that electrical signal travels down along the length of the axon. Now, before we start talking about the parts of the axon, I want to talk about something that happens as a neuron ages. There are going to be times when organelles get a little old. And as they get a little old, they're going to be broken down. Organelles get broken down by a special type of organelle that we mentioned back in chapter 3. See if you remember what that was. That is a lysosome. Lysosomes, remember, were like the stomach of the cell. One of the things that they do is they will break down an organelle when it gets old. And as that breaks down, most of that substance is going to be exocytosed. It's going to be removed from the cell. But not all of it, especially bits and pieces of mitochondria. They will actually start to build up inside the cell. And since these neurons live your entire life, well, over time, there's going to be more and more and more of that debris building up. That stuff, that debris, that basically cellular garbage, is called lipofuscin. Lipofuscin starts to show up as dark flecks inside of a neuron in the cell body. Well, that lipofuscin can be used kind of to determine the age of a person, because the older they are, the more lipofuscin there will be. Well, we just saw that the flow of electricity goes from the dendrites through the cell body and then out through the axon. The more lipofuscin there is built up inside the cell body, we're going to interfere with that passage. So that is how aging works to interfere with neuronal activity. The older you are, the more cellular debris, the more of that lipofuscin there is. The more lipofuscin there is, the more difficult it is for a neuron to perform its job. So now back to axons. These axons, sometimes we saw over here that we have ganglia and nucleus, clusters of cell bodies. Well, when we have clusters of cell bodies, we're also going to have clusters of these axons. The axons are all going to be running the same direction. So let's go back. If we have a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, well, all of the axons are going to be running in the same direction towards the central nervous system. And then if we have a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system, all of the axons are going to be running towards the peripheral nervous system. So the cell bodies are going to be clustered together as either ganglia or as nuclei. All of the axons are going to be clustered together as either a nerve or a tract. So nerves are clusters of axons in the peripheral nervous system. Tracts are clusters of axons in the central nervous system. Now, each axon is connected to the cell body by this funnel-shaped area. This is called the axon hillock. The axon hillock, sometimes called the trigger zone, the axon hillock is how the neuron, the cell body, connects to the axon. The axon hillock is how the neuron cell body connects to the axon. Now, the axon hillock is going to play a very important role in our next two lectures. It is the axon hillock that determines if this neuron is going to send an electrical signal or not. We will see how over the next two lectures. But for right now, what you need to know is the axon hillock is what connects the axon to the soma, and it is the axon hillock that determines if this neuron is going to send an electrical signal or not. So moving down into the axon cytoplasm is called the axoplasm. Axoplasm is just the cytoplasm inside of an axon. There's a lot of cytoskeleton here, but there are not very many organelles here. We will see some organelles traveling down the length of the axon along that cytoskeleton, but in general, the axon does not have very many organelles inside of it. The plasma membrane of an axon is called the axolemma. The axolemma is just the plasma membrane of the axon. Now, some axons are wrapped with this insulation called the myelin sheath. And if they are wrapped with the myelin sheath, the outer layer of that myelin sheath is called the neurolemma. So the neurolemma is the outer layer of the myelin sheath. The axolemma is the outer border of the axon itself. Now, if we look at this axon, sometimes it will branch. It does not branch as extensively as the dendrites do. Some sources just show one long, straight axon until we get to the very end when there's a little bit of branching. But here we can see that there's actually a branch coming off. When this happens, this is called an axon collateral. Axon collateral is just a branching point of an axon. But axons do not branch as much as dendrites do. Now, when we get towards the end of an axon, it starts to really fan out. This is called the terminal arborization. Arbor means tree, so this is just saying at the end, it starts to really branch out like a tree does. And at the very end, we have these things called axon terminals. Axon terminals, or sometimes they're called terminal boutons or terminal buttons, there's a small swollen area at the very end of each branch. And this is the part that is going to actually communicate with the next cell. Maybe it's another neuron, maybe it's a gland, maybe it's a muscle cell. Whatever it is, the next cell in line is going to be communicated with by these axon terminals or these terminal buttons. That point where the terminal buttons or the axon terminals is kind of bumped up against the next cell in line, that is called a synapse. A synapse is the point where an axon terminal and another cell bump up against each other. And we're going to look at that in the third lecture of this chapter. But if we were to zoom in on one of these terminal buttons, or these axon terminals, inside there are a lot of vesicles just stored there. These are called synaptic vesicles. Remember vesicles? Those are those storage containers or transport containers. Well, there are a lot of them inside these axon terminals. They are called synaptic vesicles. And they are full of those neurotransmitters that we mentioned in the first slide. We will see what they do in lecture number 3. Now, this is how the neurons are structured in most of the nervous system. But in the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, at the end of the neuron, instead of having these axon terminals, instead we have something called varicosities. So as it branches, we have these swollen spots all along the length of those branches instead of just at the end of them. They're still going to be full of neurotransmitters inside synaptic vesicles. It's just the structure is a little bit different. But really what we're going to be focusing on are these neurons like we see up here in the top right. Okay, so that's just kind of an introduction to nervous tissue and a neuron structure. The next 2 lectures, we're going to be looking at how these neurons actually work. So, like I said earlier, please go back and refresh on voltage, because that is going to be a very, very big topic in our next lecture. If you have any questions at all, please let me know, and I will talk to you next time. Take care.